It's a great honour to be chairing a fabulous panel with Dan Hannan and James Orr. Thank you both for joining us, and thank you so much to the Legatum Institute for hosting us tonight and the amazing work of the Free Market Roadshow and all the organising team that have worked so hard to put on the event that we have today. The Conservative Party stands at a crossroads. The prospect of a Labour government looks almost inevitable. It is going to be incredibly difficult for the soul of the Conservative Party to work out what it stands for and what it wants to fight for. The battle between the Tory party is going to be something that actually might be many Conservative politicians' first vote will actually be who they want to be their next leader. The Free Marketeers and the National Conservatives might need to reconcile those differences. We have emblematic figures in front of you today for that very conversation. The debate, in many ways, that brought the Conservative Party together is that alliance between the old Whigs and the Tories of the 1830s, the difficult fight for whether or not we need to be facing the world from an inward or outward perspective. What it means to have a broad church Conservative Party that can have Macmillan, Margaret Thatcher and David Cameron as leaders of a party. We want to explore the effects of 2016. We want to explore the effects of what Conservative Party could be created after that general election. And I want to hand over to both of you to introduce yourself and give a brief opening statement about what that means to you. Dan, may I start with you?
Well, good morning. My name is Daniel Hannan. I'm a Conservative working peer and a newspaper columnist. I'd like to begin with somebody who was the original Freecon in this country, Lord Hannan of High Cross. I see there's a number of IEA people in the room, and there'll be all sorts of IEA adjacent people in the room, so he seems a suitable place to start, because he told me something absolutely fascinating not long before his death in 2006. The calamity that overwhelmed the Liberal Party here in the 1950s. They went down to 6 MPs in the 1951 election, 6 MPs in the 1955 election. By the way, in those days, a figure that fairly accurately reflected their electoral strength. They were on less than 3% of the popular vote. Drove the small number of active classical liberals into something of a quandary. Were they going to remain active in politics, or were they going to withdraw into intellectual purity, read papers to each other at the Mont Pelerin Society, and try and keep the idea alive, rather in the manner of those Irish monks in the Dark Ages who kept copying out the sacred texts and thereby preserving civilization through the dark times? Ralph was very much a proponent of being politically engaged. But there was then the question of which party. If the Liberals were no longer there, how were you to operate? The actually Labour Party was, of course, creating these huge state behemoths in healthcare, education, social security, and so on. But the Tory party of that time was imperialist, paternalistic, and mildly protectionist. Nonetheless, with Labour nationalising anything that moved, the choice was an obvious one. And so what they did was to begin to convert individual Conservative MPs, and to expose them to the right kind of reading, and to convince people. Geoffrey Howe and Nick Ridley and Enoch Powell, and then the big breakthrough was with Keith Joseph, who became, if you like, Margaret Thatcher's John the Baptist. They were aware throughout that theirs was the minority position. They were like a rider perched precariously atop a great elephant. The elephant was, if you like, the mass of the Conservative movement, moved by its own instincts, very genuine and real instincts: patriotism, religious faith, distrust of officialdom, suspicion of excessive social change, dislike of indecency. Like any good mahout, they knew that they could whisper in the great beast's ear. They could steer it slightly, but only slightly. If you jabbed your goad too vigorously, it was not going to end well for you. The point I'm making is that the classical liberals always knew that they were the minority party. And therefore, there weren't really, despite the way this debate has been framed, two equal and clashing traditions. The classical liberals who moved into the Conservative Party and who found their apotheosis in the Thatcher era, when we went from being the slowest growing country in Europe to the fastest growing, always understood that they were part of a broader alliance. They were, if you like, fusionists. Now, we didn't use that word on this side of the Atlantic, but a very similar thing had happened on the other side of the Atlantic at around about the same time. We forget how recently the two big parties in the US were not primarily defined by their place on a left-right axis, but were at least as much defined by regional or hereditary voting patterns. And it was really the figures around Bill Buckley at the National Review who brought together these disparate strains of anti-socialist thought, the strict constitutionalists, the Christian evangelicals, the classical liberals, etc., and said, this is what we have in common, and this is how we build a majority. And just as Ralph Harris's project found its culmination in the Thatcher moment, so the fusionists found theirs with Ronald Reagan. And again, taking a country that had been dishonoured and impoverished and was sliding in the world and putting it back on top. Where does that leave us today? Well, the fusionism of that era on both sides of the Atlantic was driven by the need to bury differences in the face of a common enemy. As Tom correctly says, the Tory party here began as a merger of the Whig and Tory traditions. My old history tutor at Oxford always used to say, these days the differences between Whig and Tory are small enough that they can be deferred until after the grave. Right? We're so far away from either ideal that there's really no point in having furious arguments about drugs or pornography when we can agree on the big stuff. Right? And I think that was certainly true then, in the dying moments of the Cold War. Is it true now? In those days, we had a clear external enemy that was as hostile to the liberal as to the conservative traditions. Aggressive, expansionist Soviet communism, with a large number of allies and fellow travellers in our own countries. We forget how many people in our academia, in our media, in those days fundamentally wanted the other side to win the Cold War. These days, the threat has shifted, but the fundamental opposed ideology of authoritarian tribalism has not. If you look at what the enemies of the West say that they have in common, the Iranians, the Chinese, the Russians, and so on, all it really is a dislike of Western civilization. And that also has its supporters on our campuses and in our institutions here. And they're driven by the same thing, which is, again, a fundamental dislike of Western culture. So those kids on our universities now chanting about Israel, they're not really fundamentally motivated by an interest in Islamic culture. But what really gets their juices flowing is a dislike of the West, of what they would see as Western colonialism, which is not so different from the anti-Iraq war people that I remember from my own student days, or indeed the anti-Vietnam people of a generation earlier. Right? When they were shouting ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, it wasn't really because they were excited about the rights of the Vietnamese, it was that they were against the West. And so I think that fundamental external push from a tradition that is every bit as hostile to liberalism as to conservatism still makes the case for some kind of fusionism today. Which is why I don't really see myself as opposed to James at all. He's a good man and a patriot, and I flatter myself a friend. And he was kind enough to invite me to the NatCon conference 18 months or so ago, and I made a speech about Edmund Burke in which I spoke about, the ultimate NatCon pin-up, if you like, the father of the Anglo-American conservative tradition, who was nonetheless an unequivocal free trader, and as we would now understand it, economic liberal. He didn't see any contradiction, and fundamentally neither do I. If we become narcissistic in our nitpicking over tiny ideological differences, rather than agreeing on the big stuff, parental control of schools, welfare reform, private property and so on, then we open the door to a very different style of government. And if we fall into that pit, we may not be able to clamber out of it.
Fantastic. James?
Thomas, thank you very much indeed. My name is James Orr. I'm a Don at Cambridge. I work in philosophy of religion, moral philosophy, political philosophy, and I moonlight as chair of the Edmund Burke Foundation UK, in which capacity I organised the conference that Daniel referred to last year. It's a great pleasure to be here. May I just thank Fred and Rado and the Legatum team for putting this event together. There are choppy times ahead, as Thomas noted, and in choppy waters we need mother ships, and I think Legatum is proving to be just that, the mothership that we will all need to be, the ark in which we will all need to be cowering over the next 1, 2, or even 3 electoral cycles, depending on how this fusionist project, neo-fusionist project, unfolds. I promised Thomas that we would work very hard to ensure that furious agreement would not break out. I will do my best. The title of our dialogue, I think, was National Conservatism versus Liberal Conservatism. And maybe, if you had to pick a side, one way to do that, one little litmus test, would be to ask yourself, do you think National Conservatism is a tautology? And do you think Liberal Conservatism is an oxymoron? I tend to think that way. That is to say, I wish it were not the case that conservatism needed the qualifier, national. I wish conservatives did not need to be reminded that the national interest is the order of the day, is our first and ultimate priority. And I take a view of conservatism. I differ probably from Daniel here, and certainly from our mutual mentor and great friend Roger Scruton, that I don't think that conservatism is a hesitation within liberalism. I don't think conservatism is a liberalism driving at the speed limit. In fact, I learnt that, I think, from Daniel's wonderful Paean to the Anglosphere, how we invented freedom about 10 years ago. It's conservatism, though it self-consciously snaps into existence in reaction to the emergence of enlightened liberalism, that really it had been there all along. So national conservatism, NACON, what is going on here? Is it just some alien US import? Is it some clever Zionist strategy? Both were the chief charges levelled at us at our conference, our inaugural UK conference a year ago, which stirred things up wonderfully, created a lot of friction, many sparks flew. And the great thing about those sparks is that they provoked and they illuminated and made us conclude on the organising committee that this was a job well done and a job to be done again. What is national conservatism? Well, I'd encourage you just to look at our statement of principles, which has inevitably a US inflection here and there in its tone and in some of its emphases and concerns. But broadly speaking, it is easily repurposed to our current context and to our current crises. To just point to 4 or 5 of them, I might just start by noting the importance of recovering some sort of national story or a national pride, a qualified pride in our nation and in our history. This may be a feature of déformation professionnelle, a term I learnt from Daniel. As an academic, I am constantly in the history wars. I'm constantly trying, though I'm not a historian, to resist attempts by my colleagues and by my students to campaign for year zero, to campaign for the dismantling and repudiation of our history and our hinterlands. That is, I think, fatal to our national self-confidence. It is especially fatal if you take a liberal attitude towards immigration, because if we're going to assimilate successfully, we need a successful story. We need pride, albeit qualified pride, in our family code and our conventions and our cultures, our culture and our mores. Secondly, the principle of national independence. Again, something that that's a path I took to national conservatism, nourished in part by Daniel's books on Brexit and the book I referred to earlier, the basic principle of national self-determination. National conservatism is born almost immediately in the wake of Brexit. It is born in 2016 as a recognition that what happened on this island in 2016 was not sui generis entirely. Of course, we had our own specific reasons to leave, but was in fact part of a sentiment that was increasing, was surging across the West. a sense that democratic accountability was no longer what it was, that democratic deficits were opening up all across the West, a sense that our institutional landscapes were being increasingly captured by a transnational ideology, again, one that I saw coming much sooner than most, being in the Ivory Asylum. We saw it coming back in 2012, 2013, and I urged all my colleagues and friends in SW1 that what's happening on campus is not going to stay on campus, so get ready. And I couldn't agree more with Daniel that we're facing a foe that is comparable in some ways to the foe that we faced before 1989 at the height of the Cold War, though in some ways a lot more challenging. Back then, at least we knew what victory looked like. We knew that when Moscow fell, Marxism fell. What's our Moscow? That's not at all clear. We're up against an ideology that hates our values, hates our history, hates our story, hates our civilization. And this is something that is emergent. It's a sort of peer-to-peer, acephalous movement. It's splitting families, it's wrecking institutions. It's very, very difficult to counter. It's especially difficult to counter if you have been nourished in the traditions of Anglo-American conservatism, or at least English conservatism. We English conservatives don't take to the barricades easily. In fact, we never have. We are not natural reactionaries. Compare this to one of the wonderful things about being part of this transnational national conservative movement is that I get to spend time with conservatives in continental Europe in particular. We've just come back from a conference in Brussels, or should I say siege, in Brussels 6 weeks ago or so. And one of the things you learn is just how quietist we are as conservatives in the UK. We don't have any of that passionate Catholic reactionary anger that characterises de Maistre and those other great conservative thinkers of the 19th century. And that, I think, is a virtue. I think it's something we can be proud of. However, it leaves us in a quandary when we are faced with the capture of our institutions and our culture and our civil service, institutions which we naturally have an instinct to conserve. We can't work out. We're very resistant to burning it all down and starting again. Maybe, thank goodness. But we need to adapt a new strategy, and National Conservatives are busily working on how best to do that, and we are seeking alliances wherever we can. I've spoken for long enough, but I think we can touch on immigration in the Q&A. I think this may be a point of difference, but again, I think of degree more than anything else. And finally, the questions of family and faith, those will come up too. Again, that will need to be modulated a little, particularly the faith question in the UK context. But I think it's time we can now open up for discussion. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. So to get us started, for your ideal international strategy, how much of that is soft power, and what's the role of the UK in leading that? Should we prioritise government investment or the liberalisation of trade barriers? James first and Dan?
I'll go quickly. I saw a couple of weeks ago that we came second in the worldwide soft power index. I used to get rather proud about that, not partly because there wasn't too much else, too many other international tables that we were topping. And I gather that much of our soft power comes from, when you look at the detail, it turns out that our soft power status is owed largely to the universities and our cultural output, mainly the BBC, and the Premier League, which the government is about to start regulating. That gave me pause for thought. I also started to think a bit more about what soft power is exactly, and I wondered what the Houthi rebels firing at British ships in the Straits of Hormuz thought of hadn't they seen the league table? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, it's our soft power that is much, much vaunted by the Foreign Office. I mean, in fact, they never stop talking about it. It's just basically a sort of stunt. I can't see any real value to it at all. And very quickly, look, I'm pretty sceptical about our foreign aid budget. I'm worried that we're investing up to 13 billion in the Ukraine when our levelling up fund is barely hitting 5 billion. I'm glad that the government has reduced our foreign aid from 0.7 to whatever 0.5 of GNI. I think that is a good thing. I don't think we should be hypothecating these taxes anyway, or these allocations. And why on earth is foreign aid going? Why is Afghanistan at the top of our foreign aid donees? Why are we giving £71 million a year to China? Why are we giving money to Pakistan? Why are we giving money to Nigeria, a country that is doing absolutely nothing, as far as I can see, to restrain Boko Haram from kidnapping and massacring Christians? I mean, if we're going to have a foreign aid budget, please can we attach some conditions to it and use it to exert power around the world as opposed to making ourselves feel virtuous?
Hear, hear.
The president of Argentina was interviewed last week, and he was asked how he planned to take back the Falkland Islands, given that he has ruled out the use of force. And he said, well, we're going to be so rich, if we make all these economic reforms, that people will want to join. Now, I think that's an ambitious strategy, right? And I think that even if somehow Argentine GDP per head were to overtake that of the now oil-rich islands, there would still be a great deal of resistance from the islanders for all the reasons of national rootedness and organic loyalties, which James has spoken of so eloquently. But isn't it a pretty good attempt to make, right? Isn't everybody better off as a result of Argentina taking that path? It's obviously vastly better for Argentina, and better for the Falkland Islands, and better for every neighbour and trading partner of the Argentine Republic. So I think soft power, and indeed hard power, depend fundamentally on growth. And that is something that we in this country seem to be losing interest in. The kinds of reforms that would significantly increase our GDP and raise our living standards are deferred or ignored because politicians are not willing to risk short-term unpopularity in pursuit of long-term prosperity. The kinds of things that we all know need to happen. Significant NHS reform so as to bring it into line with almost every other system in the world where there's some customer-facing aspect. Allowing the pension age to reflect changes in longevity. Allowing houses without litigating the whole of the last session to be built more or less so that cities can expand. All of these things are just pushed further and further off the agenda, and nobody cares. I was thinking about this very much the other day when I was stuck waiting for a delayed flight, listening to the angry comments of my fellow passengers. And 90% of them blamed the airline, and 10% blamed the airport, and 0 blamed the politicians and protesters who prevented the extra runway being built, which was the root cause of the problem. Now, when we set the incentives that way, we shouldn't be surprised if politicians balk at doing the right thing. Who would be the minister who would get all of the hassle, all of the unpopularity of decreeing that runway, when not one person 15 years down the line is going to say, oh, thank heaven, my flight was on time because that minister approved the runway, right? So I think we need to think very carefully about our political and media culture, because at the moment we are stacking all the incentives in a way that infantilise people and that prioritise short-term goodies and easy options over the kinds of decisions that will allow us to have both soft power and ultimately the capacity to pay for military hardware.
Fantastic. Faith, family and flag, something I've actually spoken to both of you about extensively. And we could even object to each of those words individually and as a group. Which order would you put those words, and why? So for individuals, it's obviously up to you. I mean, what faith you have, if any, is none of my business, and what family you have, if any, is none of my business. You may be happy with your family, you may not, and that's not a matter for government policy. But as a matter of public policy, I think, summarising in that way, flag has to be at the top for this reason. We must relate one to another primarily as citizens. Our primary political identity needs to be a civic one. If our primary identity within a polity
is not as a British citizen or whatever citizen, but as a Presbyterian or as a gay person or as a child of Jamaicans or whatever it is, then very quickly you lose the common basis which makes democracy possible. We have to have enough in common, one with another, to accept government from each other's hands. We have to have what Roger Scruton used to call the politics of the first person plural. Now, in recent years, we have moved further and further away from the ideal of common citizenship, in other words, every adult citizen being treated the same way by the law, and we've started to prioritise or reward or categorise various other attributes. And I think that that is an incredibly dangerous and malign development. I think when Conservatives say, oh, you know, harumph for political correctness gone mad, they underestimate quite how appealing this ideology is on a genetic level, because we are a tribal species. We evolved in kin groups. And very quickly, if we're not taught to think as citizens, we will devolve into this balkanised society. And that, I mean, I can't beat Thomas Sowell on this. You can't maintain an open society on the basis that two babies born on the same day arrive in this world with a set of pre-existing grievances.
I would answer the question in a very similar way. At the individual level, I think questions of ultimate meaning and faith probably will come first, whether you like them or not. We are all shaped by our deep commitments about the world, and whether we've reflected on them or not. It's old colleague of mine in Cambridge used to say that Christianity or metaphysics always buries its undertakers. It's always comes back. You can never sort of suppress those questions. But that's at the individual level. Family as well, that would be the next concentric circle. And then flag, I mean, and you know, nationhood I would see as the outermost concentric circle that can sustain just about, and it takes work, that can sustain concrete political loyalties and affections. And that's the sort of, I suppose, a central plank of national conservatism. It's not fetishizing the nation. It's not putting the nation above family or above one's congregation or above one's community. It's simply recognizing that that's really the last post beyond which political loyalties will not be easily commanded. We do not fight and die for the United Nations. We never did for Brussels. You know, our pulse is not going to never beat a little bit quicker when we heard Beethoven's Ode to Joy, etc., etc. However, at the national level, plainly, Daniel is correct. And I would just add, but I would add one caveat. I referred earlier to the repudiation of our national story, and I'm regularly told that. Don't I know that Britain is a secular nation and that we don't do God, etc., etc. And I would say, well, that may be true. But if it is true, it's a very, very recent phenomenon. We are historically a Christian country. A lot of our mores, a lot of our conventions, a lot of our cultural attitudes and postures, a lot of our moral reflexes that made us the success we have been in many ways, as Tom Holland and others have argued. Is non-negotiable, and it is being attacked and repudiated, I think, by a progressive ideological agenda. So I would simply caution that whilst we do not want it to feature in public policy, and I'm deeply alarmed at the rise of sectarian politics as evidenced in the recent council elections and so on and so forth, it's something that we neglect and ignore at our peril. I wish it were the case that the Church of England was not the Liberal Democrat Party at prayer. I wish it were the case that the UK was not the world's only left-wing theocracy. And if only we had the institutional structures and an established church that was able to provide the kind of moral counterpoint and illumination to many of our national debates that it is so singularly failing to provide today. So not much disagreement there. I'd settle with the faith family flag order at the individual level and flag family faith order at the national level. And I think I'd add a fourth F, and that's freedom. But I would make sure that freedom is downstream of the other three, certainly downstream of flag. We need to understand we should not be articulating freedom as a sort of Sartrean existentialist hero might do, or as an anarcho-capitalist might do. Freedom needs to be ordered. It needs to be structured and constrained. So I'd put freedom downstream of the other three.
Fantastic. Is the culture war a distraction or fundamental to the future of the Conservative Party?
Can I just say, first of all, it would be lovely if the Church of England were occasionally the Church of England at prayer. I think they'd be a lot better at their jobs if... I was struck that the only time the bishops roused themselves to issue a collective statement during the lockdown, the only time, they didn't once say, have no fear of death if you've lived your life properly, which you might think was their primary job. The only time was to condemn Dominic Cummings for driving to Barnard Castle. And that does call into question what they're doing. Look, I think culture wars have taken off with an alarming speed as a result of the deracination that has followed from the spread of smartphones. I mean, we've become deluged with information, but we seem to have lost any ability to apply the filters of plausibility, proportionality, or reason to them. We've become prone to believe in conspiracy theories, and we've become very agitated about political matters about which often we know very little. 20 years ago, I was one of the people who lamented the amount of political apathy. Boy, do I miss it now. I mean, I wish we could go back to that rather cooler-headed time when people said, that doesn't affect me, and I don't really know much about it, instead of driving themselves into these hysterical rages about things where they've often misunderstood the basic facts. So I think we have no option but to engage. But look, I come back to the importance of education. The Enlightenment is counterintuitive. Teaching people to listen to someone from a different tribe is a necessarily didactic process. No one's going to intuit that on their own. Our most basic heuristic as a species is my tribe good, your tribe bad. We reason back from our preferred outcomes, and we are deeply clannish. And what has made the nation-state possible, and indeed made modern civilization possible, is our schools and universities acting as temples of the Enlightenment and educating people in a bunch of conclusions that are in the exact sense are counterintuitive, that run up against instincts and intuitions buried deep in our genome. Well, I worry that we are not doing that now. It seems to me hard to deny that our educational institutions, instead of teaching difficult and counter-cyclical and counterintuitive ideas about personal responsibility, are now going down this road towards saying the most important or the most interesting thing about you is that you're white or female or whatever it is. And I go back to saying it's very difficult to run a free society on that basis. I'll make, if I may, one other observation about the relationship of flag and freedom. After I spoke at James's conference, I had a lot of very interesting conversations with the delegates. Very, very polite, intelligent, young, and generally very well-tailored people in their 20s, whose starting position, in most cases, was, why are you prioritizing free market dogma over the national interest? And I realized as I spoke to them that free marketeers are almost as misunderstood by elements of the right as we always have been by the left. People extrapolate views that really none of us has ever held. And the idea in particular that you are motivated by some doctrinal wish to see markets running as some kind of work of beauty rather than as a way of making everyone better off and happier and freer is a remarkably widespread one. And so I would try and argue that, look, if by national interest you mean serving the interests of the greatest number of people in the nation and thereby enriching and strengthening the nation, then the best way of doing that is to have minimal government intervention and minimal tariffs and trade distortions, because by definition those are the things that privilege one section over everybody else. They are the things that allow one group of people with political connections or strong trade unions or whatever it is to earn a living at the expense of the general citizen. So I don't think anyone comes into this world as a kind of Hayekian libertarian. Right? The schools had to teach that. These were also counterintuitive truths. When people say free market dogma, actually there's nothing dogmatic. A dogma is a belief that you hold regardless of the evidence. Well, nobody starts with a belief in free markets. It's a totally counterintuitive notion. You'd think, if you didn't know any better, you'd think that it would make a great deal of sense to have some wise committee making decisions and steering the economy. You'd think that it would make great sense, instead of having two competing factories doing the same thing, to reallocate one of them to something more productive. You know, the trouble is that whenever these things have been tried, they lead to disaster. So free markets are not a dogma, they are a pragma. They are something that work in practice much better than you would expect them to. And people come to that realization through a process of acculturation and education. And that, I'm afraid, is where we're falling down at present.
So very quickly on the cultural wars question, I mean, I often feel like, I used to feel like Trotsky's friend, you know, I don't care about the cultural wars, leave me alone. What Trotsky's friend said about the dialectic, and Trotsky's famous reply, probably apocryphal, but it's got some sense to it. You may not care about the dialectic, you may not care about the cultural wars, but the dialectic and the cultural wars cares about you. We can't escape it, even if we wanted to. I deeply regret that and indeed agree with progressive friends that we are importing a lot of these cultural war debates and neuroses from the United States. I regret that, having secured our political independence from Brussels, we have seemed to be still a kind of a colonial cultural outpost of Harvard and Silicon Valley, Manhattan and Washington. And I think part of the antidote to that is cultivating our own national story, and an honest and self-critical national story. I remember when the riots broke out in the summer of 2020, after the killing of George Floyd. And I remember my astonishment that within 48 hours, I was being asked by colleagues and students about the skin colour of philosophers on my undergraduate reading lists. This was just quite extraordinary. Marx urged the workers of the world to unite, but it seems like the wokesters of the world are extremely united. And this is an ideology that this one side of the cultural wars, and it's really a one-sided war at the moment. You need two sides for a war to happen, and there hasn't been much resistance to it of late. So it's something that we're stuck with, but we need to cultivate our own. We need to do a lot of historical work, and I'm very proud of colleagues who are part of the History Reclaimed movement that has done a couple of symposia here, I think, in fact. That's acting as a sort of rapid response unit and trying to sort of shoot down all of these crazy year zero stories targeting on statues and paintings and reparations and so on. And I'd also point to some successes that we've secured in the cultural wars in the UK that in many ways raise us up as a leader in confronting this new ideology. We've seen it, I think, in the debate about race after the Munira Mirza's commission from 2 or 3 years ago. I think some of the recommendations of were implemented, and that, I think, helped to some extent reset the narrative on that contentious question. And of course, on the debates over gender-critical feminism and transgender ideology, I think we've seen the Conservative government at least show some resilience and some clarifying and sensible rhetoric. But that's not going to go away, and I think when the next government comes in, we're going to see that the cultural wars will be turbocharged, and we need to be ready for it, whatever side of the national or liberal conservative divide one finds oneself.
May I just add one thing on that? And it's a good example of fusionism. I've always been really very empire skeptic on Gladstonian grounds. Adam Smith made a very good argument about how expensive, ungrateful, and ultimately harmful it was to have these overseas colonies. But I find myself having to defend the historical truth from all of these absurd calumnies, and above all from this total lack of perspective. What is being taught now taught in schools, not just on media, is a morality tale in which English-speaking white men are these kind of Alan Rickman-type figures, these kind of global villains. And it is important to tell the truth, which is, yes, the whole world, including this country, was a player in the slave trade. That you won't find one continent or one archipelago where it didn't happen. But what was exceptional about the UK, truly exceptional, is that it not only stopped it, but then poured its blood and treasure for decades into a campaign to extirpate the entire commerce, even diverting ships when it was in a life and death battle with Napoleon to hunt down the slavers. And if we're not prepared to tell that story, then we're not engaging in history at all. We're engaging in propaganda whose ultimate purpose is to devalue the present by saying the reason that the West got rich was not because of free contracts, independent courts, secure property rights, but because of plunder. When visibly, patently, that was not the case. Every imperial acquisition was fiercely resisted by Whitehall on grounds that it was a huge expense. And they were the theme that runs through the 19th century and early 20th centuries, these abolitionists and missionaries and do-gooders are now creating another headache by making us responsible for some other bloody tract of land which is going to lead us to nothing but more expenditure. So let's, by the way, they were right in my view about that. Some of you may disagree, but let's at least ensure that we tell the story. When people say, tell the story, warts and all, it would be nice if occasionally they get around to the and all, and the and all in this case involves the most expensive moral foreign policy ever pursued by any country. In the 7 decades after 1807, we spent 1.8% of GDP per year on stamping out slavery.
Good. One more question, and then we're going to turn to questions from the audience. We're seeing some countries take direct action to increase birth rates, decrease divorce rates, and encourage family life. Is this a matter for the British state?
Lots of states have tried to do something about this. And there are things you could do to tweak it at the margins. Right? If you were serious, if you wanted to say, look, you paid no income tax if you have a child under 3, that would have an impact. Right? Especially if you made it a transferable allowance within couples. That would be, you would have however, the fundamental problem here is cultural, not economic. What are the first words that God speaks to the human race in the book of Genesis? It's kind of weird, this. You know this. Go forth and multiply and replenish the earth. That's a weird thing to say. Why do you need to be told to do that? Right? Why do you need instructions to go forth and multiply? Well, at that time we were in Eden. You had everything. Everything was perfect. Why complicate? Why bring in any distractions at all? Now, from the point of view of almost any of our ancestors, we in the West and in equivalent advanced East Asian societies are in Eden. We have on tap a level of living standards that previous generations would have attributed to gods or sorcerers. And so is it any wonder that people are making the same calculation? Why bother? And fundamentally, I think we misunderstand the capacity and the role of government if we think that that is something that can be addressed by subsidies or credits. This is what influences the number of children people have is the cultural assumptions around them. What are their friends doing? What do their parents do? And there needs to be a very different conversation about that. Otherwise, two very, I hope, fairly uncontentious points about this. Number one, most women end up with fewer children than they said they wanted when they were young. So something has happened on the way, just if you were taking that as a general measure. And number two, we are facing an absolute, we in the West are facing an absolute collapse of our finances if the worker to pensioner ratio keeps moving in the direction that it does. Now, we can massively raise the retirement age, that will stave it off for a bit. We can import hundreds of thousands of workers, but that postpones the problem because they have children. Or we can start having more babies. And I think if you put it that way, it's pretty clear which one we should be working on.
Again, furious agreement from me. I mean, I would simply add to Daniel's analysis that the problem is a cultural one rather than a state or economic one, by pointing to the conclusions of a friend of ours and a friend of this institute, Eric Kaufmann, whose early books was Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, back in 2011, 2012. And he found that though the causation is tricky to establish, it does look as if it's countries with high levels of religious adherence that have correspondingly high total fertility rates. Now, that's not a call for some sort of government-mandated, let alone Church of England-mandated Christian evangelical revival, but it is, again, something to add to the list of things to be concerned about as we leave religion and Christianity behind. Daniel's absolutely right that one can really only tweak at the margins, but if something can be changed, if something can be tweaked at the margins, let's look at the margins and let's do the tweaking. It's not fashionable to turn to Mr. Orban for domestic policy advice, I know. So I think the fashionable thing to do in SW1 is to talk about Estonia, which seems to be basically copying those policies. But now, those policies, it's interesting. They're spending an eye-watering amount of percentage of their GDP on those policies, I think up to about 5%, something extraordinary. And what have they got for that? Well, they have reversed the decline from, I think it was 1.25 or so in 2010. It's now pushing 1.6. By the 2040s, on current trajectories, it would hit the 2.1 replacement rate. So it's not, it's slow, but it's working. And it's not true that fiscal measures and government policy can't have an impact. And if you look at the numbers, you look at the sort of downstream effects of a lot of those policies. So without any legislation at all, we've seen abortion numbers go down, we've seen divorces go down, we've seen marriages go up, and crucially, we've seen female participation in the workforce go up, partly because of some of the tax benefits. So I think we should think carefully about the way in which we can change and modulate the tax system, which at the moment is, relative to other European countries, very hostile to family formation. The French have a much more interesting approach to this that cultivates and incentivizes family formation. So there's lots that can be done at the margins, lots that can be tweaked, and so we should do some tweaking.
Fantastic. Questions from the audience? Let's start at the back and work our way forward.
Hello, Alex Morton from the CPS. I'll sort of two questions for sort of slightly separate. The first one is on liberalism, and a quote from someone, which is, "Free institutions are next to impossible in a country made up of different nationalities." And that's not Scruton or Burke, it's J.S. Mill. So my question is to Daniel Hannan, why has the liberal tradition lost grip with the sort of empirical nationalist tradition? So Hume, Smith, Mill, they are all nationalists, civic nationalists, but they're all nationalists. But these days, liberalism tends to get associated with a sort of rootless cosmopolitanism that is not actually the large bulk of its tradition. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on why that is and how do you reverse it. And to slightly be the faith, flag and family, I think to break up the complete agreement, the most interesting point in many ways about fertility is that the most socially conservative countries in the developed world, East Asia, have very low births out of wedlock, very little divorce, very little premarital, and they're very disapproving of premarital sex. They also have the lowest fertility rates. As countries seem to get developed, there is a strong inverse correlation between religious and social conservatism and birth rates, which is probably not what people in this room want to hear, but that would be my sort of counterblast to the idea that you can interfere too much, because actually people in the West, where there is a greater freedom between the sexes and around the sexual revolution, fertility rates have held up much more than East Asia, where they're basically at sort of like terminal levels.
Dan?
Well, on your second point, look, I think fundamentally every country goes through the same trajectory, which is that birth rates suddenly fall after infant mortality falls. I mean, there are different ways of measuring this, right? So sometimes you can correlate it to female education. You can one of my favourite studies correlated it very closely to the spread of television. It was just like having something else to do. But actually, I think the likeliest explanation is simply that you have a rogue generation who still have the cultural habits of their parents, who will have 10 children, when in fact those children are likely to survive infancy, and then and then it plummets. I actually don't mind a small decrease in global population. What I'm worried about is that in this part of the world, it's a cliff edge. And there are ways of, if the population of this country fell back to 45 million over several decades, we could sustain that, right? But that's not the situation we're facing. And I think I think there are all sorts of things. Yes, maybe we can tweak it, but fundamentally, this is a question of culture and fashion and confidence. And when at the moment, you've still got all these sort of, Harry and Meghan reliably jumping on every dim-witted trend saying, oh, it's bad for the environment to have babies, we're going to limit ourselves to 2. They are expressing how a lot of people think. And until that changes, it doesn't really matter what the tax incentives are. You have to celebrate the human race, which should be kind of a fairly low barrier to entry thing to do. But look, on your national liberalism point, I think that's really fascinating. And I could have added Edmund Burke to your list. He was, when he read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he said, this is the best book I've ever read. Everyone quotes Burke. The one thing that everyone who hasn't read Burke can quote from Burke is the I'm your representative, not your delegate speech to the electors of Bristol. The issue on which he'd fallen out with the electors of Bristol is an interesting one. The electors of Bristol wanted him to uphold trade restrictions on Ireland so that it would work in the interest of Bristol merchants. They didn't want the competition. And Burke said, hang on, it's in the interest of my constituents as a whole to have a prosperous Ireland next door. And the story, by the way, is rarely told to the end. The electors of Bristol flung him out after he said that. But the point is, he was an absolutely committed free trader, and it never occurred to him that there was the slightest contradiction between the patriotism that he preached and the idea of the demos and the commensurate idea of personal freedom. I just make this point to those of us in the room who are Brits. This is especially easy for us because our national tradition, by and large, is a liberal one by global standards, right? By which I mean one that elevates the individual and private property and the security of contract. What we trace all the way back to the Bill of Rights, all the way back to the Great Charter, even before that to the folk right of Anglo-Saxon law, is by global standards a fundamentally liberal settlement. So we are being patriots by being free marketeers, property worshipping liberals. That's a slightly trickier thing maybe if you're Russian or whatever, but it's not a problem for us. And so we don't need to create these barriers where they don't exist.
Thank you. Well, I'll be quick. This is, sorry, Alex, your question. Yeah, East Asia. I mean, look, maybe it depends on the religion. I mean, Daniel quotes Genesis. Perhaps it's something unique to Abrahamic monotheism. I don't know. I'd have to go back to Eric's book. And it may also be the case that the negative effects of newfound prosperity simply outweigh the positive contributions that religiosity or social conservatism might make. All the more reason, therefore, to look hard at what sort of fiscal and economic measures we might take in the manner of Estonia and others, to try and think very, very hard about how we can slow down our careering towards the cliff edge that Daniel described. On Mill, Hume, Smith, yes, I mean, it's nice to be reminded of that, and nice to be reminded that classical liberalism recognised the importance, or rather the dangers of multiculturalism, as we, I think, are beginning to recognise today. If we had been a bit more dogmatic and insistent on the importance of a monoculture in our country, I think, as I said earlier, we would have managed to pull off assimilation a little bit better than we manifestly have done. I think there is now a widespread consensus that multiculturalism has failed, that that's a disaster for us in terms of social trust and in terms of our economy and culture.
Fantastic. We've got 5 minutes remaining, so we'll do 3 quick questions. 1, 2, 3.
May I express profound disappointment that you guys have been in such total agreement the entire time. And in order to prevent any further such agreement, let's get to some hard facts about national conservatism versus liberal conservatism, at least from what I know of it in the American context. Our version of national conservatism is not really in favor of free trade. And another bright line divide is Ukraine. You see a lot of folks and the people who favor freedom are saying, hey, we've got to fight this fight there, rather than in our yard when it comes. So, James, what do you think of free trade and the American version, which is very much anti? And Dan, do you agree with James about the waste of money, UK money spent on Ukraine or not?
Very quick answers.
Yeah, very quickly. Look, on free trade, I simply note that the attitude one has to free trade policy in the UK is going to be very different given the status of the US economy as the world economy. I take myself a pretty open attitude towards free trade. I probably share the reservations of my American colleagues on the extent to which free trade, kind of doctrinaire commitments to free trade, undermines national security. I think there is a difference between buying semiconductors from the United States and buying semiconductors from China. I am worried about selling our Hinkley PowerPoint C to the Chinese. I do think we should be concerned that 60% of UK equities are now in foreign hands. Look, at one level it's good that foreign companies like our shares and like our companies and are buying them up, but it does mean that investment income goes overseas, and I think we should think hard about how we're allocating our capital there. So those would be some brief responses. I mean, there are clear differences from across the national conservative movements from country to country, and there's a lively debate. I would note that we're actually planning our Washington conference in July, and I think you'll find that there's been quite a shift in the wake of 2016 and Trump's sort of ultra-protectionism, and I think you'll be seeing a slightly different temper to the debate in July.
On Ukraine, Rod, I'm very simplistic about this. In 1994, Ukraine surrendered its nuclear weapons in exchange for a guarantee that its independence and integrity within its existing frontiers would be respected. Who signed that guarantee? The United States, the United Kingdom, and, never forget, Russia. For Russia then to break that treaty and invade them after they had given up their weapons ranks as one of the greatest acts of betrayal in modern geopolitics. And it leaves us in the position of having to defend the principles that we signed up to when we agreed that memorandum. Now, this is not the first time we've been there. We were drawn into two monstrous wars in the 20th century, not because we were attacked, but because we'd promised to uphold the sovereignty of a friendly country, respectively Belgium and Poland. You could argue that the world would have been a better place if there hadn't been that original promise with the case of Belgium. But once you've made it, you have to maintain a law-based order. And I think we have no alternative in Ukraine but to do this. By the way, if you were... I'm well aware of the conversations in your country. I spent a couple of days in Congress talking to some of the Ukraine skeptic Republican congressmen. The argument that they kept coming back to, we're spending $40 billion, we could use that money. First of all, I don't think it was a sincere argument, because at that time, when I was there, the abominations of the 7th of October had just happened. So I would say, at the end of every conversation, I'd say, so presumably also not funding Israel. Oh, no, that's completely right. It was never about the money, right? It was about a lingering resentment over the cameo role that Ukraine had played in the Trump impeachment. But even if we take that figure at face value, if you could have said to any US general, you will degrade the military capacity of your chief geostrategic rival for a mere $40 million without putting one US life at risk, that general would be regarded as greater than Caesar and Napoleon and Alexander the Great put together. So I just don't really buy the argument that this is somehow escalation on our side. We're doing the right thing.
Fantastic. Well, I thought that was an amazing panel, and I thought you were both absolutely fabulous. So a huge congratulations.